The cornerstone of empire. The day St. Peter's Basilica began, April 18, 1506. Pope Julius II lays the cornerstone. You know what's crazy? On a beautiful spring morning in 1506, this older guy with a flowing white beard was walking through the streets of Rome surrounded by a huge crowd. He was dressed in these incredible robes that literally sparkled in the sunlight. But this wasn't just any man taking a stroll through the city. This was Pope Julius II. They called him the Warrior Pope, and he was about to do something that would change the world forever. Picture this. April 18, 1506, Julius is walking to Vatican Hill to place the first stone of what would become St. Peter's Basilica. But here's the thing. There was already a basilica there, a 1,000-year-old church that people considered the holiest place in Christianity. And this guy was about to tear it down and start over. Can you imagine the guts that takes? It'd be like someone today saying, "You know what? I think we should demolish the White House and build something better." So what was going through Julius's mind that day? Why to risk everything to build something new? What was buried under that ground where he placed that first stone? And how did this one ceremony, this one moment, end up accidentally launching the Protestant Reformation, emptying the Vatican's bank accounts, and creating the most mind-blowing church you've ever seen? Trust me, this isn't just a story about some old building. It's about massive ambition, unbelievable talent, and a fight for the very soul of the Christian world. Rome in 1506 was a weird mix of glory and decay. This city that once ruled the world had fallen hard. Instead of 1 million people living there during the Roman Empire, there were only about 50,000. Ancient monuments were crumbling. People were literally taking stones from the Colosseum to build their houses. There were sheep grazing where Roman emperors once gave speeches. Meanwhile, other Italian cities like Florence and Venice were having this incredible cultural explosion. The Renaissance was in full swing there, and Rome, supposedly the center of Christianity, was being left behind. This drove Pope Julius absolutely crazy. Julius wasn't your typical pope. This guy grew up relatively poor in a seaside region of Italy and climbed the church ladder partly because his uncle became Pope Sixtus IV. But where other popes focused on prayer and church matters, Julius was more like a CEO or a general. He personally led armies into battle to expand the territories the church controlled. People literally called him the terrifying pope. But Julius was smart enough to know that winning battles wasn't enough for the history books. He wanted to make Rome the most impressive city in the world again. And to do that, he needed someone who could build his vision. Enter Donato Bramante, this brilliant architect who'd been studying ancient Roman ruins for years. At 2, Bramante wasn't young, but he understood something crucial. Buildings aren't just places to go inside. They're statements of power that can last for centuries. Julius and Bramante came up with a plan so bold it shocked people. Even for a warrior pope, this was extreme. The original St. Peter's had been there since around 320 CE, built by Emperor Constantine. It marked what people believed was the burial place of Peter, you know, the apostle, who became the first pope according to Catholic tradition. This building was basically the foundation of the church's authority. But by 1506, the place was falling apart. The south wall was leaning dangerously. Over the centuries, it had been fixed and patched so many times that it looked like architectural Frankenstein's monster. Despite being historically important, it didn't match Julius's grand vision for Rome. Other popes had tried making repairs. Pope Nicholas V had started strengthening parts of it back in the 1450s, but Julius wasn't interested in half measures. He wanted to completely demolish the 1,000-year-old church and build something that would blow people's minds. The message he was sending couldn't be clearer. Just as Rome had transformed from an empire of soldiers to an empire of faith, now the ancient church would be replaced by something even more magnificent, a physical symbol of papal power that would make jaws drop for centuries. Not everyone was on board. One cardinal wrote that many people thought it was improper, indecent, and impious to tear down a church where countless Christians had worshipped for a millennium, where saints and popes were buried. Julius basically said, "Too bad." When the warrior pope decided something, that was it. So the big day arrives, April 18th, 1806. Julius didn't just pick this date randomly. People back then took astrology seriously, and supposedly the stars were perfectly aligned. Plus, it was the Saturday before a special Sunday in the church calendar that talked about Christ as the cornerstone of faith. Julius loved that symbolism. As the sun rose, Rome came alive with excitement. Julius had ordered everyone who mattered to show up: cardinals, bishops, nobles, foreign diplomats. He wanted witnesses. Regular Romans lined the streets, feeling mixed emotions about losing their ancient church, but caught up in the spectacle. At exactly the scheduled time, Julius made his entrance wearing the full pope outfit, the ornate robes, the jeweled hat, carrying the papal staff. People said he had this intense look of determination despite being 63, which was pretty old back then. The procession wound through Rome's narrow streets, getting bigger at every turn until it reached Vatican Hill, where a massive hole had been dug, over 26 feet deep, where one of the main supports of the new church would stand. This wasn't just any hole. Julius and Bramante had ordered workers to dig past the foundations of the old church until they hit what they thought was untouched soil. They wanted both a solid physical foundation and a powerful symbolic one. As Julius approached the pit, the crowd went silent. What happened next was recorded by several people who were there. Julius climbed down into the excavation with Bramante and a few chosen cardinals. At the bottom was a massive marble block, the Cornerstone, with Julius's name and the date carved into it. Before it was set in place, Julius blessed the foundation and, according to some accounts, placed gold and silver coins with his face on them into the ground. Then Julius and Bramante spread mortar with ceremonial trowels. Workers lowered the huge cornerstone into position. Julius made the sign of the cross over it, and just like that, St. Peter's Basilica was officially begun. A guy named Paolo Giovio, who was there, wrote that Julius raised his eyes to heaven and stretched out his hands, praying loudly that God would bless the work his hands had started. Cannons fired from Castel Sant'Angelo, announcing to everyone in Rome that it was done. The crowd erupted with mixed emotions, cheers of excitement but also tears for the ancient church that would now be demolished. What almost nobody realized at that moment was how this single ceremony would unleash both incredible beauty and religious upheaval that would transform Europe forever. Construction started right away, but they quickly discovered what they were really getting into. This new basilica was going to cost an absolute fortune. To pay for his dream building, Julius got creative with fundraising. One big method was selling indulgences, basically documents that promised less time in purgatory if you donated money. Julius ramped up this practice to fund St. Peter's, and this decision would later become one of the main things that triggered Martin Luther's protests and eventually split Christianity in two with the Protestant Reformation. The papal treasury was being drained dry. Julius redirected money from military campaigns and diplomatic missions. He hired Michelangelo to paint the Sistine Chapel ceiling, creating another masterpiece that would attract pilgrims and their donations to Rome. But despite throwing all these resources at the project, Julius never saw it completed. Construction moved at a snail's pace by today's standards. Each massive support column took months to build. Materials had to be hauled from quarries miles away. There weren't enough skilled workers to go around. When Julius died in 1513, only the 4 main piers that would support the dome had been completed. Bramante died the following year. For the next 120 years, can you believe that? A parade of popes and architects, including Raphael, Michelangelo, and Bernini, would modify, expand, and finally finish the Basilica in Antiquity. What started with that single cornerstone ceremony ultimately consumed the resources of 20 popes and the creative genius of some of the greatest artists who ever lived. The ripple effects of what Julius started that April day go way beyond just one building, no matter how impressive. First, the massive cost of building St. Peter's directly led to financial practices in the church that sparked the Protestant Reformation. When Pope Leo V, who came after Julius, expanded the sale of indulgences to keep funding the construction, he accidentally gave Martin Luther the specific complaint that would ignite religious revolution across Europe. Second, the sheer ambition of St. Peter's forced innovations in building techniques. The problems they encountered during construction pushed advances in engineering and math that benefited architecture for generations. The dome alone, designed later by Michelangelo, remains one of the greatest engineering achievements in history. Third, the Basilica became the centerpiece of the Catholic Counter-Reformation, a physical demonstration of the Church's power, wealth, and artistic patronage that stood in stark contrast to the simple, plain worship spaces of Protestants. Finally, St. Peter's established a new relationship between art, faith, and power that would influence Western civilization for centuries. The Basilica wasn't just a church. It was a statement that the Catholic Church had remained the greatest supporter of the arts and the dominant cultural force in Europe. Today, more than 5 centuries later, St. Peter's stands as the largest church in the world and the center of global Catholicism. Millions of visitors from every country and faith pass through its enormous doors each year. Looking up at Michelangelo's dome in awe, most people have no idea that this incredible building began with one stone placed by an aging warrior pope with an uncompromising vision. Even fewer understand how that moment when Julius II blessed that cornerstone on April 18, 1806, sent ripples through history that would shape art, religion, and politics for centuries. When you think about it, it makes you wonder, what cornerstone are we laying today? What foundations are we establishing for future generations? What will our ambitions cost? And what legacy will they leave? Julius understood something profound about us humans, that our greatest monuments aren't just buildings, but expressions of our highest hopes. In his quest for glory, he created both beauty and controversy, both unity and division. Maybe that's the real lesson of the Cornerstone, that our grandest achievements contain our deepest contradictions, challenging those who come after us to find meaning in what we leave behind. If you enjoyed this journey back to a pivotal moment in history, please consider subscribing for more stories like this one. Check the description and the first pinned comment for books about Renaissance Rome, papal history, and the architectural wonder that is St. Peter's Basilica. What other cornerstone moment from history would you like to hear about next? Let me know in the comments below.